When my daughter-in-law Vivian swung that cast-iron frying pan at my head, she thought she was dealing with just another helpless old woman. What she didn't know was that I'd spent 40 years as one of the top litigation attorneys in the state, and I was about to give her a masterclass in consequences she'd never forget. For 70 years, I've lived my life with dignity and purpose. My name is Catherine Fairmont, and I built my reputation as a formidable courtroom attorney in the prestigious law firm of Fairmont Associates here in Willowbrook Valley. But 3 years ago, when my beloved husband Theodore passed away after a brief battle with cancer, I made the decision to step back from active practice and enjoy my golden years in peace. Theodore and I had built something extraordinary together over our 42 years of marriage. He was a retired federal judge, respected throughout the state for his fairness and intellectual rigor, while I had carved out my own legacy as one of the most feared litigators in the region. Together, we formed one of those legal power couples that Willowbrook Valley Society magazines loved to feature, our Georgian-style mansion on Rosewood Drive serving as the backdrop for countless dinner parties where we entertained senators, Supreme Court justices, and Fortune 500 CEOs. Our home was a testament to everything we'd built together. The mahogany-paneled library housed over 3,000 legal volumes, first editions, and Theodore's collection of rare judicial opinions. The grand foyer featured oil portraits of distinguished judges and attorneys dating back to the 1800s, a visual reminder of the legal legacy we were part of. Crystal chandeliers imported from Austria cast warm light over Persian rugs that had been wedding gifts from influential colleagues. Every room told the story of two people who had dedicated their lives to justice and had been rewarded handsomely for their service. But none of that grandeur mattered anymore without Theodore's warm laugh echoing through those halls, without his gentle snoring beside me in our king-sized four-poster bed, without the morning ritual of reading case briefs together over coffee and croissants. The house that had once felt like a palace now felt like a mausoleum, every corner holding memories that both comforted and tormented me. My son Jonathan had always been the center of my world, even more so after we lost our daughter Patricia in a devastating car accident when she was only 23. Patricia had been brilliant, just graduated from law school and about to join our firm when a drunk driver ended all those dreams on a rainy Thursday evening. Jonathan was now 35, a successful investment banker at Cromwell Financial, and recently married to Vivian Montgomery, a woman whose family claimed old money roots stretching back to antebellum Charleston. Jonathan had inherited his father's gentle disposition and his mother's analytical mind, though he'd chosen the world of finance over law. He was handsome in that understated way that comes from good breeding, with Theodore's kind brown eyes and my stubborn chin. I was proud of the man he'd become, even if I secretly wished he'd followed the family tradition into law. At Cromwell Financial, he managed portfolios for high-net-worth clients, earning a respectable seven-figure salary that afforded him a comfortable lifestyle in Willowbrook Valley's exclusive Elmhurst Gardens neighborhood. His wedding to Vivian 2 years ago had been a lavish affair at the prestigious Belmont Country Club, and I had spared no expense to ensure my only remaining child had the perfect day. Vivian was undeniably beautiful, with the kind of porcelain features and honey blonde hair that graced the pages of Southern Living magazine. She claimed to be descended from Charleston aristocracy, though I noticed her family tree seemed deliberately vague about certain generations. Her mother, Patricia Montgomery, spoke with that affected Southern drawl that some women cultivate to sound more refined, and her father owned a series of moderately successful restaurants throughout South Carolina. The wedding had cost me nearly $200,000, but seeing Jonathan's happiness as he danced with his bride made every penny worthwhile. Vivian had worn my grandmother's pearl necklace, a family heirloom that had been worn by Fairmont brides for 4 generations. In that moment, passing down that tradition, I felt hope that perhaps this young woman would help heal the wounds that Patricia's death had left in our family. After Theodore's funeral, when the parade of mourners finally ended and the last casserole dish was returned, I found myself rattling around in our massive house like a ghost haunting her own life. The silence was deafening. I tried to maintain my routines, my morning yoga in the sunroom, afternoon tea in the garden, evening classical music in the library, but everything felt hollow without Theodore to share it with. That's when Jonathan and Vivian approached me with what seemed like a divine answer to my loneliness. "Mom," Jonathan had said, taking my hands in his during one of our weekly dinners, "you shouldn't be alone in that big house anymore. It's too much for one person, and frankly, we worry about you. Why don't you sell it and move in with us? We've been talking about renovating anyway, and we could add a beautiful mother-in-law suite to our property." Vivian had nodded enthusiastically, her blue eyes sparkling with what I interpreted as genuine warmth. "Catherine, we'd love to have you close by, and when we have children, which we're hoping will be soon, it would be wonderful for them to grow up with their grandmother right there. You could help us raise them, teach them about family history and values." The idea appealed to me on multiple levels. Their home in Elmhurst Gardens was indeed perfect for expansion. The sprawling ranch-style house sat on 3 meticulously landscaped acres, with mature oak trees providing shade and privacy, and a creek running through the back of the property where deer would come to drink at dawn. Vivian had decorated it in that modern farmhouse style that was so popular among young couples, all white shiplap and industrial fixtures, though I privately thought it lacked the warmth and character of traditional design. More importantly, the prospect of being closer to family filled a desperate need in my heart. I longed to be a grandmother, to have little voices calling me Nana and tiny hands to hold. The thought of being involved in raising grandchildren, of passing on the Fairmont family traditions and values that had sustained us through generations, offered a sense of purpose that retirement had stolen from me. I made what I thought was a generous offer, perhaps too generous in retrospect. I would sell my mansion, which had been appraised at $2.3 million, and contribute $1.2 million toward their home renovation. This substantial sum would fund a complete addition to their property, a luxury master suite with a sitting room, full kitchenette, bathroom with walk-in shower, and private entrance, plus a beautiful sunroom overlooking their gardens where I could pursue my hobbies of reading and watercolor painting. The remaining $1.1 million from the sale would be more than sufficient to secure my financial independence for the rest of my life, especially combined with my substantial retirement savings and the ongoing royalties from a legal textbook I'd authored on trusts and estate litigation. I also maintained several investment properties throughout Willowbrook Valley that provided steady rental income, ensuring I would never be financially dependent on Jonathan and Vivian. The renovation took 6 months, during which I lived in a luxury apartment at the Grandview Towers downtown, watching the progress through weekly photos that Vivian would text me. She supervised every detail with the enthusiasm of someone spending someone else's money, and I was touched by her apparent attention to my comfort and preferences. She chose the finest materials available, Italian Carrara marble for the bathroom countertops, Brazilian cherry hardwood floors throughout, custom millwork crafted by local artisans, and top-of-the-line stainless steel appliances for my kitchenette. When I finally moved in on a brilliant spring morning, the space was truly breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows flooded the rooms with natural light, and French doors opened onto a private flagstone patio where I could sit with my morning coffee and watch the sunrise paint the sky through the oak branches. The sitting room was spacious enough for my antique writing desk, my favorite reading chair, a burgundy leather wingback that had been Theodore's last Christmas gift to me, and built-in bookcases where I displayed my law books, my diplomas from Harvard Law School, and the framed photograph of Theodore and me at our Supreme Court bar admission ceremony. The bedroom was elegantly appointed with a queen-sized 4-poster bed, matching dresser and armoire, and a cozy reading nook by the window. The bathroom felt like a spa, with its glass-enclosed shower, soaking tub, and heated marble floors. Even the kitchenette was perfectly designed for my needs, with a small refrigerator, microwave, 2-burner cooktop, and enough cabinet space for my china and crystal. For the first year, everything seemed not just good, but idyllic.
I maintained my independence while being close enough to family to feel truly connected for the first time since Theodore's death. I established new routines that brought me joy. Morning coffee on my patio while listening to the birds, afternoon walks through Elmhurst Gardens' tree-lined streets, and evening phone calls with old friends from my law school days. I also began hosting Sunday dinners for Jonathan and Vivian, using my mother's spode china and my grandmother's silverware, trying to recreate the warm family traditions that had sustained us through 4 generations. I would spend all day Saturday preparing elaborate meals: roast beef with Yorkshire pudding, herb-crusted salmon with hollandaise sauce, cocoa van with fresh herbs from my patio garden. Vivian would always compliment my cooking effusively, though I noticed she barely touched her food and seemed to prefer ordering overpriced salads from trendy restaurants most other nights. These dinners were important to me because they represented continuity, the passing down of family customs from one generation to the next. I would tell stories about Jonathan's childhood, about the cases Theodore and I had worked on together, about the history of our family and how we'd built our success through hard work and ethical practice. Jonathan seemed to enjoy these evenings,
asking questions about his father's judicial career and my most challenging cases. I also continued to practice law on a limited basis, handling estate planning for old friends and occasionally consulting on complex litigation matters. My former colleagues at Fairmont and Associates would call when they encountered particularly thorny trust and estate disputes, knowing that my 4 decades of experience could cut through problems that stymied younger attorneys. These consultations kept my mind sharp and provided additional income, though I certainly didn't need the money. More importantly, they reminded me that my legal expertise was still valued and respected in the professional community. The work also allowed me to maintain my office in downtown Willowbrook Valley, a corner suite on the 15th floor of the Meridian building with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the courthouse where I'd won so many cases. 3 mornings a week, I would drive downtown in my silver Mercedes sedan, spend a few hours reviewing contracts or researching precedents, and lunch with former colleagues at the Willowbrook Valley Bar Association's private dining room. Jonathan seemed genuinely happy to have me close by during this period. He would stop by my suite most evenings after work, still wearing his tailored suits and carrying his leather briefcase, and we'd share a glass of wine while he told me about his day at the investment firm. He'd always been what people kindly called a mama's boy, perhaps because losing his sister had made us both more protective of each other. These quiet conversations reminded me of when he was young and would curl up in my lap while I reviewed case files, asking endless questions about why people needed lawyers and whether I ever sent bad people to jail. But as the months passed, I began to notice subtle changes in the household dynamic. Tiny fissures that would eventually become chasms. Vivian started making little comments about my old-fashioned cooking methods or my dated decorating choices for my suite. She would roll her eyes when I mentioned my law school friends or my career accomplishments, as if my professional legacy was somehow embarrassing to her rather than a source of family pride. The first real tension arose when I offered to help plan their 2nd anniversary party. I had extensive experience organizing elegant events, having hosted countless firm parties, judicial receptions, and charity galas over the years. I knew all the best caterers, florists, and venues in Willowbrook Valley, and I understood how to create the kind of sophisticated gathering that would impress Jonathan's colleagues and clients. But Vivian dismissed my suggestions with barely concealed irritation. "Catherine, that's so sweet of you to offer, but we want something more modern and age-appropriate. Your generation's idea of a party is very different from ours." The party she ultimately threw was a casual backyard barbecue that felt more like a college reunion than a celebration of marriage, complete with beer pong tables and a playlist of music that seemed designed to exclude anyone over 30. I tried to dismiss these moments as generational differences or the normal adjustment period that comes with extended family living arrangements. After all, I reasoned, Vivian was young, only 28, and perhaps felt intimidated by having such a successful mother-in-law living in such close quarters.
I remembered feeling similarly overwhelmed when I first married Theodore and had to navigate his prominent family's expectations and social obligations. But the incidents became more frequent and more pointed. Vivian would make snide remarks about older people who didn't know when to step back or who tried to control everything from beyond the grave. She started referring to my section of the house as the granny flat in front of friends, which made me wince every time I heard it. When I gently corrected her, saying, I prefer the garden suite, she would laugh with fake sweetness and say, Oh, Catherine, you're so formal about everything. It's just a room, not a royal palace. I began to notice that Vivian's friends, young women with perfectly highlighted hair and designer handbags, would whisper and giggle when they thought I couldn't hear them. I caught fragments of their conversations. Living with your mother-in-law, no privacy, would drive me crazy. It became clear that I was a subject of gossip and pity among their social circle, portrayed as the clingy widow who couldn't let go of her son. The situation became significantly more complicated when they finally announced they were expecting their first child. I was absolutely overjoyed. This was what I'd been hoping for, the chance to be an involved grandmother and to help raise the next generation of Fairmonts. I immediately offered to help with nursery preparation, to share my extensive collection of parenting books that had guided me through Jonathan and Patricia's childhoods, and to provide whatever support they needed during pregnancy and beyond. But instead of the gratitude I expected, I sensed immediate resistance from Vivian. When I suggested traditional family names for the baby, perhaps Theodore for a boy to honor his grandfather, or Patricia for a girl to remember the aunt she would never meet, Vivian made it very clear that they would choose their own names without input from anyone. We want our child to have their own identity, not be burdened with the past, she said coolly. When I offered to host a baby shower using my finest china and my extensive connections to Willowbrook Valley's social elite,
Women who had thrown legendary showers for generations of prominent families, she declined with what felt like disdain. We want something more intimate with just my college friends. Your crowd is a bit too formal for what we have in mind. Most hurtfully, when I asked about being present for the birth or helping during those crucial early weeks when new mothers need the most support, Vivian informed me that her mother would be coming from Charleston to provide postpartum care. We wouldn't want to overwhelm you, Catherine, she said with false sweetness that didn't mask the underlying rejection. Taking care of a newborn is exhausting work, and at your age, well, we just think it's better if someone younger handles the night feedings and diaper changes. The baby, a beautiful little girl they named Lily Rose, arrived on a crisp October morning while I sat in my suite, listening to Vivian's labor sounds through the walls and feeling utterly excluded from one of the most important moments in my family's history. When Jonathan finally brought her to meet me 3 hours after the birth, I'll never forget the rush of unconditional love that flooded through me as I held her for the first time. She was perfect in every way. Theodore's dark hair already visible in soft wisps, what I hoped were the Fairmont family's intelligent brown eyes, and tiny fingers that wrapped around mine with surprising strength. In that moment, holding my granddaughter against my chest and feeling her steady breathing, all the tension with Vivian seemed insignificant compared to this perfect little miracle who carried our family's future in her small body. But even my relationship with Lily became a source of escalating conflict. When I would rock her to sleep in my antique rocking chair or read her classic children's stories from the leather-bound volumes I'd saved from Jonathan's childhood, Vivian would hover anxiously in the doorway, making sharp comments about disrupting schedules or overstimulating the baby. When Lily began to smile at the sound of my voice and reach for me when I entered the room, Vivian started limiting my time with her, claiming the baby needed more consistent caregiving and fewer confusing influences. I tried desperately to be understanding, remembering how protective and overwhelmed I'd felt as a new mother 40 years ago.
But it was emotionally devastating to watch from an increasingly distant sideline as Vivian's mother, Patricia Montgomery, swept in from Charleston like a conquering general and assumed the grandmother role I had hoped to fill. Patricia was the embodiment of what Southerners call a steel magnolia, all honeyed accent and razor-sharp edges, with perfectly coiffed silver hair and an extensive wardrobe of pastels that probably cost more than most people's cars. From the moment she arrived, she made it abundantly clear that she considered the Fairmont family nouveau riche compared to her own Charleston pedigree, which allegedly included a signer of the Declaration of Independence and a Confederate general whose portrait hung in her dining room. Patricia would stay for weeks at a time, taking over the main guest room that had been intended for short visits and treating me like an unwelcome intruder in what was supposed to be my family home. She rearranged their entire household to suit her preferences, criticized my cooking as too heavy for new mothers, monopolized time with Lily, and made pointed observations about people who insert themselves into young families instead of allowing couples to establish their independence. Her presence transformed the dynamics of the house completely. Suddenly, my Sunday dinners were deemed too formal and replaced with casual brunches featuring Patricia's famous shrimp and grits. My stories about family history were interrupted with Patricia's endless tales of Charleston society and the Montgomery family's supposed aristocratic connections. Even my gifts for Lily, carefully chosen books, hand-knitted blankets, and an antique silver rattle that had belonged to my grandmother, were set aside in favor of whatever trendy items Patricia brought from her shopping expeditions. The final straw came when I overheard Patricia suggesting to Jonathan and Vivian that my presence was making it difficult for them to truly bond as a nuclear family. Speaking in her most persuasive tone, she recommended that I consider moving to one of Willowbrook Valley's lovely senior communities where I could make friends my own age and enjoy age-appropriate activities instead of trying to relive my parenting years through their child. Catherine is a lovely woman, I heard her say, through the thin walls between my suite and their kitchen, but she needs to accept that this phase of her life is over. Young families need space to grow, and hovering grandparents can actually interfere with proper bonding. There are some beautiful retirement communities here that would be perfect for someone of her circumstances. When I heard those words, sitting alone in the beautiful suite that I had paid for with my life savings, I felt a pain sharper and more devastating than any I'd experienced since Theodore's death. After everything I had given up, my family home, my independence, my financial security, I was being discussed like a problem to be solved rather than a family member to be cherished. That night, lying in my lonely bed and staring at the ceiling while Lily's cries echoed from the main house, I realized how catastrophically naive I had been. I'd let grief and loneliness cloud my judgment, mistaking tolerance for love and manipulation for genuine care. Vivian never wanted me as part of their family. She wanted my money for their renovation and my eventual absence from their lives. But I was Catherine Fairmont, senior partner of one of the most successful law firms in the state, veteran of 40 years of courtroom battles.
And I hadn't built my reputation by backing down from fights when the stakes mattered most. If they wanted to test the limits of my patience and generosity, they were about to discover that this 70-year-old woman still had plenty of fight left in her. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was that beneath my grandmother's smile and my polite acquiescence to their increasingly outrageous demands, the sharp legal mind that had built Fairmont and Associates was already analyzing every slight, documenting every manipulation, and preparing for a battle they couldn't possibly imagine. The war was about to begin, and they had just handed me all the ammunition I needed to destroy them. The morning that would change everything started like any other Tuesday in November. I woke at 6:30, as I had for decades, made my coffee in the small kitchenette, and settled into my reading chair with the Willowbrook Valley Herald and my daily devotional. Outside my French doors, frost sparkled on the flagstone patio, and I could hear Lily's happy babbling through the walls as Vivian got her ready for the day.
I had no way of knowing that within hours, my entire world would collapse in the most violent and humiliating way possible. The trouble began when I decided to surprise the family with Thanksgiving dinner preparations. The holiday was still 2 weeks away, but I'd always been a planner, and I wanted this first Thanksgiving with baby Lily to be perfect. I had in mind a traditional Fairmont family celebration, the kind Theodore and I had hosted for years, with our finest china, crystal stemware, and a menu that had been passed down through 3 generations. At 9 o'clock, after I heard Jonathan leave for work and the house settled into its morning quiet, I knocked gently on the connecting door between my suite and the main kitchen. I'd been respecting Vivian's wishes for privacy by using this door only when specifically invited, but surely planning a family holiday warranted an exception. "Vivian," I called softly. "I was hoping we could discuss Thanksgiving dinner. I have some wonderful family recipes I'd love to share, and I thought we could plan the menu together." I heard Jonathan's high chair being pulled across the floor, then Vivian's voice, sharp with irritation. "Just a minute, Catherine. I'm feeding the baby." I waited patiently in the hallway, admiring the family photographs that lined the walls. Pictures of Jonathan's childhood, our family vacations, his college graduation, their wedding. Looking at these images, I felt a familiar warmth. This was my family, my legacy, my reason for giving up everything to be here. When Vivian finally opened the door, she was holding Lily on her hip, the baby's face smeared with what looked like pureed sweet potatoes. Vivian's hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she wore yoga pants and an oversized sweatshirt that somehow managed to look expensive despite its casual appearance. "What do you need, Catherine?" she asked, not inviting me into the kitchen, despite the fact that I was standing awkwardly in the doorway. "Well, I was thinking about Thanksgiving," I began, trying to keep my tone light and collaborative. "I know how busy you are with the baby, so I thought I could take charge of the dinner preparations. I have my grandmother's turkey recipe, it's been in the family for over a century, and I could handle all the traditional sides. The cranberry sauce, the stuffing with chestnuts and sage, the sweet potato casserole with the brown sugar crust." Vivian's expression grew progressively colder as I spoke. "Catherine, we've already made plans for Thanksgiving." "Oh." I felt a flutter of confusion. "I didn't realize. What were you thinking?" "My mother is flying in from Charleston next week, and we're going to her favorite restaurant downtown, the Magnolia Room at the Grandview Hotel. It's much easier than cooking, especially with a baby." I felt as if I'd been slapped. The Magnolia Room was fine for business lunches, but it was hardly the place for a family Thanksgiving. More importantly, this was the first I'd heard of these plans, despite living in the same house and supposedly being part of the family. "A restaurant?" I couldn't hide my disappointment. "But Vivian, I was hoping we could have a real family gathering, something traditional with Lily's first Thanksgiving being special. I could handle all the work. You wouldn't have to do anything except enjoy the meal." Vivian shifted Lily to her other hip and looked at me with what I can only describe as barely contained contempt. "Catherine, not everything has to be done your way. We want something relaxing and modern, not some stuffy, formal dinner that takes all day to prepare." "It's not stuffy," I protested gently. "It's tradition. These recipes have been in our family for generations. I thought it would be meaningful for Lily to experience." "Lily is 6 months old, Catherine. She doesn't care about your family recipes. She eats pureed vegetables and formula." The dismissive tone in her voice made my chest tighten, but I pressed on. "Well, then for Jonathan. He grew up with these traditions. Remember how he used to help me make the cranberry sauce when he was little? He'd stand on a step."
"Jonathan's perfectly happy with restaurant meals," Vivian interrupted curtly. "He's not some child who needs to relive his past every holiday. We're making our own traditions now." I stood there for a moment, processing the sting of her words. Our own traditions. As if everything the Fairmont family had built and cherished for generations was somehow inadequate or outdated. As if my presence and my history were obstacles to be overcome rather than assets to be treasured. "I see," I said quietly. "Well, Perhaps I could at least make a dessert? My apple pie with the lattice crust? Jonathan has always... The restaurant has an excellent pastry chef, Vivian said firmly. Really, Catherine, we don't need you to cook for us. We're perfectly capable of handling our own holiday celebrations. She started to close the door, but something in me snapped. I'd been patient for months, accepting every slight and dismissal, but this felt like the final rejection of everything I was trying to contribute to this family. Vivian, wait, I said, placing my hand gently on the doorframe. Can we please just talk about this? I feel like I'm being shut out of my own family's celebration. I've given up everything to be here, to be part of Lily's life, and now I'm being told I can't even contribute to Thanksgiving dinner? Her blue eyes flashed with sudden anger. Given up everything? Catherine, you chose to sell your house and move in here. Nobody forced you. And if you're not happy with the arrangement, maybe you should consider other options. Other options? The words felt like ice water in my veins. What do you mean? I mean, she said, stepping fully into the doorway and lowering her voice to a harsh whisper. Maybe it's time you accepted that this isn't working out the way any of us hoped. You're here all the time, hovering, trying to control everything we do. Jonathan can't even come home from work without you cornering him for one of your little chat sessions. I can't raise my own daughter without you interfering with your opinions about everything from feeding schedules to bedtime routines. Each word hit me like a physical blow. I'm not trying to control anything. I'm trying to help. I'm trying to be a grandmother. You're trying to be the mother. My mother. Jonathan's mother. Lily's mother. But you're not, Catherine. You had your turn at motherhood, and now it's mine. I don't need you telling me how to cook or clean or raise my child. I felt tears stinging my eyes, but I fought them back. I've never tried to tell you how to raise Lily. I've only offered suggestions when you seemed overwhelmed, and I've respected every boundary you've set. I use the connecting door only when invited. I don't enter the main house without permission. I've tried so hard to what? To make yourself indispensable? To justify your presence here? Vivian's voice was rising now, despite her earlier attempt at discretion. Let me be clear, Catherine. We don't need you here. We never did. Jonathan felt sorry for you after his father died, and I went along with it because I thought it would be temporary. But you've made yourself comfortable, haven't you? Settled right in like you own the place. I do own part of this place, I said, quietly, immediately regretting the words but unable to stop them. I paid for the renovation. I contributed over $1 million to... And there it is. Vivian's face flushed red with fury. The truth finally comes out. You think because you threw money at us, you can buy your way into our lives. You think your money gives you the right to insert yourself into every decision we make. That's not what I meant. I only meant that this is my home too, that I thought I was welcome here. Well, you thought wrong, she snapped. This is Jonathan's house and my house and Lily's house. You're a guest here, Catherine, and guests don't get to make demands about holiday dinners or child-rearing decisions or anything else. I stared at her in shock, finally seeing the depth of hatred that had been simmering beneath her polite facade for months. This wasn't about Thanksgiving dinner or family traditions. This was about territory, control, and the fundamental question of where I belonged in their lives. If that's how you feel, I said, with as much dignity as I could muster, then perhaps we should discuss some alternative arrangements. I certainly don't want to be where I'm not wanted. Vivian's eyes lit up with what looked like satisfaction. Finally, yes, I think that would be best for everyone. My mother actually knows about a lovely assisted living community in Meadowbrook. It's very nice, more appropriate for someone your age.
You'd have people to socialize with, activities designed for seniors, medical staff on site. It would be perfect. The words hit me like a physical assault. Assisted living? She was talking about putting me in a facility like I was some doddering invalid who couldn't care for himself. Me, Catherine Fairmont, who built a law firm, argued cases before the Supreme Court, and managed complex estates worth millions of dollars. I'm 70 years old, Vivian, not 90. I don't need assisted living. I need to live with my family. Do you, though? She asked, with mock sympathy. Catherine, be honest with yourself. You're lonely, you're depressed, you're trying to recreate a life that's over. Jonathan has moved on. He has a wife and a child and a career. He doesn't need his mommy hovering over him anymore. The cruelty of her words took my breath away, but before I could respond, she continued with even more venom.
And frankly, your constant presence is affecting our marriage. Jonathan feels guilty about everything. Guilty when he doesn't spend enough time with you. Guilty when he does spend time with you instead of me and Lily. You're putting him in an impossible position, and it's not fair to him. Jonathan has never said anything to me about feeling guilty, I protested weakly. Of course he hasn't. He's too kind to hurt your feelings. But I see what this is doing to him, the stress you're causing in our home. A good mother would recognize that and step back. A good mother. The phrase echoed in my mind like a taunt. I had been a good mother. I had raised Jonathan and Patricia with love and dedication. I had made countless sacrifices to give them the best possible life. And now this woman, who had known Jonathan for barely 3 years, was telling me that being a good mother meant disappearing from his life entirely. I think, I said slowly, trying to maintain some semblance of composure, that this conversation should include Jonathan. These are decisions that affect the whole family, and no, Vivian said firmly. Jonathan doesn't need to be burdened with this. I can handle it. In fact, I've already started looking into options for you. There's a beautiful place called Sunset Manor that specializes in seniors who are having trouble adjusting to life changes. They have counselors who help with the transition from independent living. She was talking about me like I was suffering from dementia or some other cognitive decline. The professional in me recognized the tactic. She was reframing the situation to make my perfectly reasonable desire to live with family seem like a pathological inability to accept reality. Vivian, I said slowly, fighting to keep my voice steady, I think you're being unnecessarily harsh. I understand that adjustments are needed, and I'm willing to make them. We can establish clearer boundaries, better communication. Catherine, you're not listening. This isn't about boundaries. This is about the fact that you don't belong here anymore. You had your life, you raised your children, you had your career and your marriage. That chapter is over. Now it's time for Jonathan and me to write our own story without you trying to be the narrator. I felt something breaking inside me, some fundamental belief about family and loyalty and love that had sustained me through 70 years of life. And now this woman who had known Jonathan for barely 3 years was telling me that being a good mother meant disappearing from his life entirely. I think, I said slowly, trying to maintain some semblance of composure, that this conversation should include Jonathan. These are decisions that affect the whole family, and no, Vivian said firmly. Jonathan doesn't need to be burdened with this. I can handle it. In fact, I've already started looking into options for you. There's a beautiful place called Sunset Manor that specializes in seniors who are having trouble adjusting to life changes. They have counselors who help with the transition from independent living. She was talking about me like I was suffering from dementia or some other cognitive decline. The professional in me recognized the tactic. She was reframing the situation to make my perfectly reasonable desire to live with family seem like a pathological inability to accept reality. I think, I said slowly, trying to maintain some semblance of composure, that this conversation should include Jonathan. These are decisions that affect the whole family, and no, Vivian said firmly, Jonathan doesn't need to be burdened with this.
Vivian's expression hardened instantly. Jonathan doesn't need to be involved in this conversation. He has enough stress at work without having to deal with family drama. This is between you and me, Catherine. Woman to woman. But he's my son, I protested. Surely I have the right to discuss my living situation with my own son? Your son is my husband, Vivian shot back. And as his wife, it's my job to protect him from unnecessary stress and conflict. If you truly love Jonathan, you'll handle this quietly and gracefully without putting him in the middle. I stared at her, finally understanding the full scope of her manipulation. She was isolating me from Jonathan, cutting off my ability to present my side of the story or defend myself against her characterizations. By the time Jonathan learned what was happening, I would already be gone, and Vivian would be free to shape the narrative however she chose. I'm not going to be pushed out of my family, I said, with more strength than I felt. I'm not going to be railroaded into some facility because you've decided I'm inconvenient. Vivian's eyes flashed with anger. Railroaded? Catherine, I'm trying to help you. You're clearly struggling with the transition to this stage of your life, and you're taking it out on everyone around you. The healthy thing would be to accept help instead of fighting it. The healthy thing, I said, my voice rising, despite my efforts to stay calm, would be for families to support each other instead of discarding family members the moment they become inconvenient. Inconvenient? Vivian laughed harshly. Catherine, I'm not inconvenient. You're destructive. You undermine my authority with my own child. You criticize everything I do, and you make Jonathan feel guilty about living his own life. That's not inconvenient. That's toxic. The word toxic hit me like a physical blow. This was the final reframing, the ultimate dismissal. I wasn't a grieving widow trying to stay connected to my family. I was a toxic presence that needed to be removed for everyone's well-being. That's not true, I said weakly. But even as I spoke, I could see how easily Vivian's version of events could sound plausible to someone who wasn't living through it. Isn't it? Vivian stepped closer to me, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. Tell me, Catherine, when was the last time Jonathan seemed truly happy when he was with you? When was the last time he sought out your company instead of just enduring it out of obligation? The questions cut deep because they contained just enough truth to hurt. Jonathan had seemed stressed lately, distracted during our evening conversations. I had attributed it to pressures at work, but what if Vivian was right? What if my presence was causing him conflict? I started to speak, then stopped, uncertainty creeping in. That's what I thought, Vivian said with satisfaction. Deep down, you know I'm right. You know that staying here is selfish, that you're clinging to a relationship that's run its course. I felt my confidence crumbling under the weight of her words. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was being selfish. Maybe my grief and loneliness had blinded me to the burden I was placing on my son's young family. I just want to be part of Lily's life, I said quietly, one last plea for understanding. Lily will visit you, Vivian said with false warmth. Sunset Manor encourages family visits. You'll see her regularly, probably more than you see her now with your restricted access to the main house. Restricted access to the main house.
She was admitting that my movements had been deliberately limited, that I was already being treated like an unwelcome guest in the home I had helped pay for. And Thanksgiving? I asked, grasping at straws. Christmas? We'll figure something out. The important thing is that you get the support you need to adjust to this new phase of your life. I stood there in the doorway feeling decades of confidence and self-assurance crumbling around me. This woman, barely 30 years old, had systematically dismantled my sense of worth and belonging with surgical precision. She had reframed every reasonable expectation as unreasonable demand, every expression of love as manipulation, every desire for connection as pathological neediness. "That's not true," I said weakly. But even as I spoke, I could see how easily Vivian's version of events could sound plausible to someone who wasn't living through it. "Isn't it?" Vivian stepped closer to me, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Tell me, Catherine, when was the last time Jonathan seemed truly happy when he was with you? When was the last time he sought out your company instead of just enduring it out of obligation?" The questions cut deep because they contained just enough truth to hurt. Jonathan had seemed stressed lately, distracted during our evening conversations. I had attributed it to pressures at work. But what if Vivian was right? What if my presence was causing him conflict? I started to speak, then stopped, uncertainty creeping in. "That's what I thought," Vivian said with satisfaction. "Deep down, you know I'm right. You know that staying here is selfish, that you're clinging to a relationship that's run its course." I felt my confidence crumbling under the weight of her words. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was being selfish. Maybe my grief and loneliness had blinded me to the burden I was placing on my son's young family. "I just want to be part of Lily's life," I said quietly, one last plea for understanding. "Lily will visit you," Vivian said with false warmth. "Sunset Manor encourages family visits. You'll see her regularly, probably more than you see her now with your restricted access to the main house." Restricted access to the main house. She was admitting that my movements had been deliberately limited, that I was already being treated like an unwelcome guest in the home I had helped pay for. "And Thanksgiving?" I asked, grasping at straws. "Christmas?" "We'll figure something out. The important thing is that you get the support you need to adjust to this new phase of your life." I stood there in the doorway, feeling decades of confidence and self-assurance crumbling around me. This woman, barely 30 years old, had systematically dismantled my sense of worth and belonging with surgical precision. She had reframed every reasonable expectation as unreasonable demand, every expression of love as manipulation, every desire for connection as pathological neediness. "That's not true," I said finally. "Of course," Vivian said brightly. "But remember, my mother arrives Monday, so we'll need to have everything sorted by then. I'll call Sunset Manor and schedule a tour for tomorrow afternoon. It really is a lovely place, Catherine. I think you'll be surprised by how much you enjoy it once you give it a chance." She started to close the door, then paused as if remembering something important. "Oh, and Catherine, I think it would be best if we kept this conversation between us for now. No point in upsetting Jonathan until we've worked out all the details. You understand." And with that, she closed the door, leaving me standing alone in the hallway that connected my suite to what I had foolishly believed was my family home. I walked back to my sitting room on unsteady legs and collapsed into Theodore's reading chair, my mind reeling from the conversation. In the space of 30 minutes, my entire future had been rewritten. I was being evicted from my home, separated from my granddaughter, and institutionalized against my will, all while being told it was for my own good.
But as the initial shock began to wear off, another emotion started to surface beneath the hurt and confusion. Anger. Cold, professional anger that reminded me exactly who Catherine Fairmont really was. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Harold Buchanan, my former partner and one of the most ruthless attorneys in the state. If Vivian Montgomery thought she could manipulate and gaslight a 70-year-old widow into submission, she was about to learn that she had picked the wrong woman to underestimate. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. What Vivian Montgomery didn't know as she closed that door with such smug satisfaction was that she had just declared war on one of the most formidable legal minds in the state. While she saw a broken, grieving widow ripe for manipulation, the truth was far more dangerous to her plans. I sat in Theodore's reading chair for exactly 10 minutes, allowing myself to feel the full weight of the betrayal. Then I did what I had trained myself to do for 4 decades of legal practice. I compartmentalized the emotion and began to think strategically. Walking to my antique writing desk, I pulled out a yellow legal pad and began making notes. At the top of the page, I wrote, Montgomery versus Fairmont, because that's exactly what this had become. Below that, I started listing facts, evidence, and potential legal strategies with the methodical precision that had made me legendary in courtrooms across 3 states. The first thing I did was call Harold Buchanan. Harold had been my partner for over 20 years before his retirement, and he remained one of my closest friends and most trusted advisors. At 75, he was still sharp as a razor and connected to every major law firm in the region. More importantly, he knew me well enough to understand that when Catherine Fairmont called with a legal problem, it was about to become someone else's nightmare. Catherine? His familiar gravelly voice answered on the second ring. This is a pleasant surprise. How are you settling into domestic bliss with the family? Harold, I need your help, and I need absolute discretion. The tone of my voice must have alerted him immediately because his casual friendliness disappeared. What's happened? I gave him a concise overview of the situation, sticking to facts and avoiding emotional commentary. Harold listened without interruption, and I could practically hear his legal mind analyzing the details as I spoke. Jesus, Catherine, he said when I finished. She's trying to have you declared incompetent. That's not just manipulation, that's financial abuse with a side of attempted guardianship fraud. That's exactly what I thought, I replied grimly. The transitional care wing at Sunset Manor isn't for normal assisted living. I looked them up while we were talking. It's specifically for patients with dementia or other cognitive impairments. She's trying to create a paper trail that suggests I'm mentally unfit to make my own decisions. Smart girl, Harold said with grudging professional respect. Evil, but smart. If she can get you committed to memory care, she and Jonathan become your de facto guardians. They'd control your finances, your medical decisions, everything. Over my dead body, I said flatly. Harold chuckled, and I could hear the sound of papers shuffling in the background. There's the Catherine Fairmont I know and love. All right, let's think about this strategically. What assets are we protecting here? I opened my laptop and pulled up my financial records. The house sale netted me $2.3 million after taxes. I contributed $1.2 million to their renovation, leaving me with $1.1 million in liquid assets. I also have my retirement accounts, another $2.8 million. The investment properties bring in roughly $180,000 annually in rental income, and there's the ongoing royalties from my textbook and consulting fees. So we're talking about protecting roughly $4 million in assets, plus ongoing income streams, Harold summarized. No wonder she wants you declared incompetent. That's a hell of a lot of money to control. There's more, I continued. I've been documenting everything since I moved in, every conversation, every slight, every instance of financial manipulation. I have records of how she systematically isolated me from Jonathan and Lily. Good. What about the house itself? How is the ownership structured? That's where it gets interesting, I said, pulling up the property records.
The renovation created what's essentially a duplex. My suite has its own entrance, its own utilities, its own address for mail delivery. When we did the permits, the city classified it as a separate dwelling unit. Meaning, I may have stronger tenant rights than Vivian realizes. She can't just kick me out with a week's notice, and since I paid for the construction, I may have an ownership interest in the property that goes beyond simple tenancy. Harold was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear him thinking, Catherine, this could get very messy very quickly. Are you prepared for that? Because once we start fighting back, there's no going back to family dinners and birthday parties.
Harold, they've already made that decision for me, I said quietly. Vivian just told me I'm toxic and destructive, that I don't belong in this family, and that I need to be institutionalized for everyone's well-being. The family dinners and birthday parties are already over. All right then, he said with satisfaction. Let's give Mrs. Montgomery a legal education she'll never forget. We spent the next hour outlining strategy. Harold would discreetly reach out to contacts at Sunset Manor to understand exactly what Vivian had told them about my supposed mental state. I would begin formally documenting every interaction, creating an evidence trail that would expose her manipulation tactics. Most importantly, we would prepare for the possibility that this conflict would escalate beyond simple family disagreement into actual legal warfare. One more thing, Harold said before we hung up. You mentioned that she wants to keep this secret from Jonathan. That isolation tactic is a classic sign of abuse, financial and emotional. Document that specifically. If this goes to court, we want to show a pattern of manipulation and control. After ending the call, I sat back in my chair and considered my options. I could play Vivian's game, pretend to go along with her plans while building my legal case, or I could confront the situation head-on and force her to show her true colors publicly. Both approaches had merit, but I decided on a third option. I would give her enough rope to hang herself. I spent the rest of the day researching Sunset Manor and its transitional care program. What I found was even more disturbing than I had imagined. The facility specialized in patients with dementia, Alzheimer's, and other cognitive disorders. The transitional care wing was specifically designed for people whose families had concerns about their mental competency, but who hadn't yet been formally diagnosed. Reading through their admission requirements, I realized that Vivian had been setting me up for weeks, possibly months. The facility required family statements about concerning behaviors, incidents of confusion or forgetfulness, and evidence that the individual posed a risk to themselves or others. I began to understand why Vivian had been so quick to characterize my normal reactions as unreasonable, my reasonable requests as demanding, and my emotional responses as unstable. She had been building a case for my incompetency one conversation at a time. But Vivian had made one crucial mistake. She had underestimated exactly who she was dealing with. I wasn't some helpless widow who could be gaslit into submission. I was Catherine Fairmont, and I had spent 40 years destroying people who tried to manipulate the legal system for their own gain. That evening, I began implementing my own strategy. I called 3 of my former colleagues who specialized in elder law and financial abuse cases, ostensibly to ask for advice about a friend who was facing pressure from family members to enter assisted living. These conversations served multiple purposes. They created a timeline of Vivian's coercion attempts. They established my clear mental competency with independent witnesses, and they put other attorneys on notice that something was happening in case I needed backup. I also called my financial advisor and my estate attorney, informing them that there might be attempts to challenge my mental competency and that all decisions regarding my assets should be verified directly with me, regardless of any claims made by family members.
The next morning brought the first test of my new strategy. Vivian knocked on my door at exactly 9 o'clock, probably assuming that a night of worry would have softened my resistance to her plans. "Good morning, Catherine. I hope you had time to think about our conversation yesterday. I've scheduled your tour of Sunset Manor for 2 o'clock this afternoon." "Actually, Vivian, I have thought about it quite a bit, and I've realized that I need to involve some professionals in this decision. I've made an appointment with my attorney to discuss the legal implications of changing my living situation." I watched her face carefully as I spoke, and I saw a flicker of something, fear, anger, cross her features before she regained her composure. "Oh, Catherine, I don't think that's necessary," she said quickly. "This is a family matter, not a legal issue. Bringing attorneys into it will just complicate things unnecessarily." "On the contrary," I replied smoothly. "Any major life changes at my age have significant legal and financial implications. I need to understand how it affects my estate planning, my tax situation, my healthcare decisions. Surely you understand that I need to protect my interests." "Of course," Vivian said, but her smile had become strained. "But there's really no rush on the legal side. We can handle those details after you've settled into your new living situation." "I prefer to handle them before," I said firmly. In fact, my attorney suggested that any major life changes should be carefully documented to ensure that I'm making these decisions freely and without coercion. The word coercion hit its mark. Vivian's eyes narrowed slightly, and I could see her calculating whether to back down or double down on her pressure campaign.
"Catherine, I'm concerned that you're making this more complicated than it needs to be," she said, choosing to escalate. "This kind of resistance to help is exactly what the folks at Sunset Manor warned me about. Sometimes seniors become paranoid about family members who are trying to help them." It was a masterful counterattack, designed to make my reasonable caution sound like paranoid delusion, but I had been expecting it. "Interesting," I said mildly. "What exactly did you tell the people at Sunset Manor about me?" "Just that you were having some difficulty adjusting to changes in your living situation," she said carefully, "and that you sometimes seem confused about boundaries and relationships." "Confused? How?" "Well, like thinking you have a say in how Jonathan and I run our household, or believing that you have some kind of ownership interest in our home." I felt a cold smile cross my face. "But I do have an ownership interest in this home, Vivian. I paid for a substantial portion of it." "You made a gift to help with renovations," she corrected quickly. "That doesn't give you ownership rights." "Actually, it might," I said pleasantly, "which is why I need to consult with my attorney. Contributions of that magnitude often create legal interests and property, especially when the contributor continues to reside on the premises." I could see the wheels turning in her head as she processed this information. She had clearly assumed that my financial contribution was a simple gift with no strings attached. The possibility that I might have legal standing to remain in the house obviously hadn't occurred to her. "Catherine," she said, her voice taking on a harder edge, "I think you're getting confused about the legal realities here. You're a guest in our home, not a co-owner." "Perhaps," I said agreeably, "but my attorney will be able to clarify that for us. I'm meeting with him tomorrow morning." "I really don't think that's wise," Vivian said, dropping any pretense of sweetness. "Jonathan is going to be very upset if you start involving lawyers in what should be a private family matter." "Then perhaps Jonathan should be part of this conversation. I think it's time we discussed these issues as a family, with everyone present." "No," Vivian said sharply, then caught herself and softened her tone. "I mean, Jonathan is under so much stress at work right now. The last thing he needs is family drama. I'm trying to handle this quietly to protect him." "Protect him from what?" I asked innocently. "From knowing that his mother is being pressured to enter assisted living? From understanding the legal implications of that decision?
It seems to me that hiding this information from him is more likely to cause problems than discussing it openly. Vivian stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her reassessing her strategy. She had expected me to crumble under pressure, to accept her characterization of the situation and go quietly into the institutional sunset she had planned for me. Instead, I was asking uncomfortable questions and threatening to involve people who might ask even more uncomfortable questions. "Fine," she said finally. "If you insist on making this difficult, then we'll do it your way. But don't say I didn't try to handle this considerately." "I appreciate your consideration," I said mildly. "Now, about that tour of Sunset Manor, I think I'll postpone it until after I've spoken with my attorney. The appointment is already scheduled. It would be rude to cancel at the last minute. Then perhaps you should call and explain that there's been a family discussion and we need more time to consider all the options," I suggested. "I'm sure they'll understand." Vivian's jaw tightened, but she nodded curtly. "Fine, I'll handle it." After she left, I sat back and reviewed the conversation. Vivian was clearly rattled by the introduction of legal counsel into her plans, which confirmed my suspicion that her tactics wouldn't hold up under professional scrutiny. More importantly, she had revealed several crucial pieces of information. She had already been discussing my supposed mental state with Sunset Manor. She was actively working to keep Jonathan uninformed about the situation, and she genuinely believed that my financial contribution gave me no legal rights. All of these facts would be extremely useful when this inevitably escalated to actual legal proceedings. I spent the rest of the morning calling several other former colleagues, ostensibly for social conversations, but actually to establish a clear record of my mental competency with as many professional witnesses as possible. I discussed complex legal concepts, analyzed recent court decisions, and even provided informal advice on a challenging case one of them was handling. By lunchtime, I had created a timeline of interactions that would make it impossible for anyone to claim I was suffering from cognitive decline or mental instability. That afternoon, I decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. Elmhurst Gardens was the kind of place that people took pride in knowing their neighbors, and I had made it a point to introduce myself to several families when I first moved in. Now, I used those relationships strategically. I stopped by the Hendersons' house first. Bill Henderson was a retired police detective, and his wife Susan was a former nurse. They were exactly the kind of credible witnesses I might need if the situation continued to deteriorate. "Catherine!" Susan exclaimed when she answered the door. "How lovely to see you! How are you settling in with the new baby?" We chatted pleasantly for several minutes about Lily, the neighborhood, and the approaching holidays. I was careful to appear completely normal and engaged, discussing current events and asking thoughtful questions about their family. Anyone observing this conversation would see a sharp, socially adept woman who was clearly in full command of her mental faculties. As I prepared to leave, I mentioned casually that I was considering some changes to my living situation and might be traveling more in the coming months. I wanted to plant the seed that any future absence from the neighborhood would be voluntary rather than the result of family pressure. I repeated similar conversations with 3 other neighbor families, each time presenting myself as a competent, independent woman making her own decisions about her future. These interactions served multiple purposes. They documented my mental state, they created a network of potential witnesses, and they established a narrative that contradicted whatever story Vivian might try to tell about my departure. That evening, Jonathan came by for our usual after-work visit. I studied his face carefully, looking for signs that Vivian had broken her promise to keep our conversation secret. But he seemed relaxed and normal, asking about my day and telling me about a challenging client presentation he had handled. "You seem to be in a good mood," he observed as we shared a glass of wine. "You've been looking a bit stressed lately." It was the perfect opening to test whether Vivian had said anything to him about our confrontation. "Oh, I've just been thinking about some changes I might make," I said vaguely. "Nothing dramatic, but it's good to periodically reassess one's living situation." Jonathan looked puzzled. "Changes? What kind of changes?" His genuine confusion confirmed that Vivian hadn't told him about her assisted living plans. This gave me a significant strategic advantage. I could control how and when Jonathan learned about the situation. Just some thoughts about travel, maybe spending more time with old friends, I said casually. I've been quite settled here, but I don't want to become too much of a homebody. Well, you know you're always welcome here, Jonathan said warmly. I love having you close by. It reminds me of when I was young and you and Dad were always there when I needed you. His words were like a knife in my heart, but they also strengthened my resolve. This young man genuinely loved having me in his life. Whatever problems existed in their marriage weren't caused by my presence, they were caused by his wife's inability to share her husband's affection with anyone else. I love being here too, I said honestly. Being close to you and Lily has been one of the great joys of my life. We talked for another hour, and I was struck by how relaxed and happy Jonathan seemed when it was just the two of us. There was none of the tension or stress that Vivian claimed my presence was causing. If anything, he seemed more at peace than he had in months. After he left, I made one final phone call of the day. I contacted Rachel Morrison, a former colleague who now specialized in elder abuse and financial exploitation cases. Rachel was brilliant, ruthless, and absolutely fearless in court. Exactly the kind of ally I would need if this situation continued to escalate. Catherine Fairmont, what a pleasant surprise. Please tell me you're calling because you want to come out of retirement and join my practice. Not quite, I said with a laugh, but I may need your expertise on a personal matter. I gave her a brief overview of the situation, focusing on the legal issues rather than the emotional aspects. Rachel listened with growing outrage. She's trying to have you committed to memory care? Rachel's voice was sharp with indignation. Catherine, that's not just family drama, that's criminal fraud. If she's making false statements about your mental capacity to healthcare facilities, she's committing multiple felonies. That's what I thought, I replied. The question is how to handle it. Do I confront her directly or do I let her continue digging herself deeper? Let her dig, Rachel said without hesitation. Document everything, record everything if it's legal in your state, and give her enough rope to hang herself. Women like this always overplay their hand eventually. And if she tries to escalate before I'm ready, then you call me immediately and we destroy her, Rachel said grimly. Catherine, I've seen this pattern before. She's not going to stop with assisted living. Once she gets you out of the house, she'll go after your assets directly. This is about money, not family dynamics.
As I hung up the phone, I felt a grim satisfaction settle over me. Vivian Montgomery thought she was playing chess with a confused old woman. What she didn't realize was that she was actually playing against a grand master who had been letting her think she was winning. Tomorrow, the real game would begin. The next morning brought the first sign that Vivian was escalating her campaign. I was awakened at 6:30 by loud voices and what sounded like furniture being moved in the main house. Through my bedroom window, I could see a moving truck parked in the driveway and two men in work uniforms carrying boxes up the front steps. I dressed quickly and stepped onto my patio to get a better view. That's when I saw her, Patricia Montgomery, emerging from a black luxury sedan like a conquering general surveying newly captured territory. She was earlier than expected, a full 5 days before Thanksgiving, and she had brought enough luggage to suggest she planned an extended stay. Patricia Montgomery was exactly what you'd expect from someone who claimed Charleston aristocracy as her birthright. She stood ramrod straight, despite being in her mid-60s. Her silver hair styled in what I recognized as a $300 cut from one of those exclusive salons that catered to old Southern money. Her designer suit was perfectly tailored, her jewelry was understated but expensive, and she carried herself with the kind of imperious confidence that came from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. What caught my attention immediately was the quantity of items being unloaded from the truck. This wasn't the luggage of someone planning a week-long visit. I watched as the movers carried in an antique armoire, several boxes labeled china and crystal, a full-length mirror in an ornate gold frame, and what appeared to be a complete set of monogrammed linens. Patricia Montgomery wasn't just visiting. She was moving in. I retreated to my sitting room and called Harold Buchanan immediately. "Harold, we have a problem," I said without preamble when he answered. "Vivian's mother has arrived with what looks like half her household belongings. I think they're accelerating their timeline." "Interesting," Harold mused.
That suggests they're more worried about your legal consultation than they let on. Have you spoken to Jonathan yet? No, and that's what concerns me. He left for work at his usual time, 7:15. Either he doesn't know his mother-in-law has moved in permanently, or he's been convinced it's temporary. Catherine, I want you to be very careful today. When people like this feel threatened, they often make desperate moves. Document everything, but don't confront anyone directly until we understand what they're planning. I spent the morning following Harold's advice, positioning myself where I could observe the activity without being obvious about it. What I witnessed was a systematic takeover of the main house that would have impressed a military strategist. Patricia had clearly done reconnaissance before arriving. She directed the movers with the precision of someone who knew exactly where everything should go. The guest room, which had supposedly been prepared for a short visit, was being transformed into a master suite. The beautiful writing desk that had belonged to Jonathan's grandmother was moved out to make room for Patricia's antique armoire. The family photographs that had lined the hallway were taken down and replaced with framed portraits of the Montgomery family ancestry. Most telling was what happened in the kitchen. I watched through my window as Patricia supervised the removal of my china and crystal from the dining room cabinets, the pieces I had been using for our Sunday family dinners. They were replaced with her own monogrammed set, complete with serving pieces that bore the Montgomery family crest. It was a symbolic conquest as much as a practical one. Every trace of my presence in the family's public spaces was being systematically erased and replaced with evidence of Patricia's authority. Around 10 o'clock, Vivian emerged from the house and walked purposefully towards my suite. I watched her approach through the French doors, noting the satisfied expression on her face. She knocked with what sounded like barely contained excitement. "Catherine, I hope you don't mind the noise," she said when I opened the door. "My mother decided to arrive a bit early, and she brought some of her favorite things to make her stay more comfortable." "Her stay?" I repeated carefully. "How long is she planning to visit?" "Well, that's actually something we need to discuss," Vivian said, stepping uninvited into my sitting room. "There have been some changes to our original plans." I gestured for her to sit, but remained standing myself, a position of psychological advantage I had learned from decades of courtroom experience. "What kind of changes?" "My mother has decided to relocate to Willowbrook Valley permanently," she announced with barely concealed triumph. "Her health isn't what it used to be, and she wants to be closer to family, especially with the baby."
I felt a chill run down my spine. And where exactly is she planning to live? "Here, of course," Vivian said brightly. "This house is certainly large enough for multiple generations. It will be wonderful for Lily to grow up with both grandmothers so close by." The implications hit me immediately. With Patricia permanently installed in the guest room, there would be no space for me, even if I wanted to return from whatever assisted living facility they were planning to ship me to. More importantly, Patricia's presence would provide continuous reinforcement for Vivian's authority and continuous pressure on Jonathan to side with his wife's family over his mother. "I see," I said calmly. "And what does Jonathan think about this arrangement?" Vivian's smile flickered slightly. "Jonathan understands that family comes first. He's always been very fond of my mother." "I'm sure he is," I replied. "But permanent living arrangements for multiple family members seem like the kind of decision that should involve everyone affected. Has Jonathan had time to discuss this with you properly?" "Catherine, you're overcomplicating things again," Vivian said with exaggerated patience. "This is a decision between my husband and me about our own home. We don't need anyone else's permission." "Of course not," I agreed pleasantly. "I was simply wondering about the logistics, financial responsibilities, household management, that sort of thing. When Theodore and I considered multi-generational living arrangements, we found it was important to clarify expectations in advance." Vivian's eyes narrowed slightly. She was clearly trying to determine whether I was making innocent conversation or probing for information she didn't want to share. "My mother is financially independent," she said carefully. "She's not a burden on anyone." "Oh, I'm sure she's not," I said quickly.
I was thinking more about the practical arrangements. Utilities, groceries, maintenance costs. Those expenses can add up quickly with additional residents. Jonathan and I can handle our own household expenses, Vivian replied curtly. Of course you can, I agreed, though I imagine Patricia will want to contribute something. People of her generation usually prefer to pay their own way. I was fishing for information about the financial arrangements, and Vivian seemed to realize it. Catherine, I don't think the details of our household budget are any of your concern, she said with growing irritation. You're absolutely right, I said agreeably. I was just making conversation. Though, speaking of household arrangements, I should probably mention that my attorney wants to review the documentation for my suite. Apparently, there are some questions about property rights and tenant protections that need clarification. Patricia's face went pale. What kind of questions? Oh, technical legal matters. Something about the permit classifications and how they affect occupancy rights. Honestly, it's all quite over my head, but he seemed to think it was important. Catherine, I don't think you need to involve attorneys in family matters, Vivian said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. Perhaps not, I replied, but since you mentioned yesterday that you weren't sure about my legal rights here, I thought it would be wise to get professional clarification. I certainly don't want to overstep any boundaries. The irony was not lost on either of us. By claiming that I had no legal rights to remain in the house, Vivian had inadvertently encouraged me to investigate exactly what rights I did have. When are you meeting with this attorney? Vivian asked, trying to sound casual. This afternoon, actually. I'm quite curious to hear what he has to say. Vivian stood abruptly. Well, I hope you get the answers you're looking for. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to help my mother get settled. After she left, I watched through my window as she hurried back to the main house and immediately engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with Patricia. Even from a distance, I could see the older woman's posture stiffen as Vivian spoke, and her gaze turned toward my suite with unmistakable hostility. Within an hour, the psychological warfare began in earnest. It started with the lawn care. A landscaping crew arrived and began what they called routine maintenance of the gardens. This involved using leaf blowers directly outside my windows for over 2 hours, making it impossible for me to concentrate on anything or make phone calls. When I stepped outside to ask if they could work on a different section of the property first, they were told they had specific instructions to complete the area around the accessory dwelling before moving on. Accessory dwelling. Not garden suite, not mother-in-law suite, the legal terminology for a secondary residence on the same property. Next came the utility inspection. A man in a municipal uniform appeared at my door claiming there had been complaints about electrical issues in the neighborhood, and he needed to check all secondary dwellings for code compliance. When I asked to see his identification and credentials, he became evasive and eventually admitted that the inspection had been requested by the property owners as part of an insurance review. I refused him entry and immediately called the city's electrical inspection department. No one by his name worked there, and no inspections had been scheduled for this address. It was a clumsy attempt to find grounds for declaring my suite inhabitable, but it demonstrated how far Vivian was willing to go to force me out.
The afternoon brought an even more disturbing escalation. I was in my kitchen preparing lunch when I heard a car door slam in the driveway, followed by authoritative voices. Looking out my window, I saw 2 men in professional attire walking toward the main house, one carrying a briefcase, the other with what appeared to be official documents. My blood ran cold when I recognized the logo on their business cards as they introduced themselves to Vivian at the front door. They were from Adult Protective Services. I grabbed my phone and stepped outside, positioning myself where I could hear the conversation without being obvious about eavesdropping. Mrs. Montgomery, we received a call expressing concern about an elderly resident at this address, the first man was saying. Someone reported that there might be signs of self-neglect or confusion that could indicate a need for intervention. Oh, yes, Vivian replied with perfectly performed concern. I'm so glad you could come. I've been worried about my mother-in-law, but I wasn't sure what to do. I felt my heart pounding as I listened to Vivian spin her web of lies with practiced ease.
She's been showing some troubling signs lately. Confusion about financial matters, inappropriate anger when we try to help her, some paranoid thoughts about people trying to take advantage of her. Yesterday, she became quite agitated and started talking about lawyers and property rights that don't exist. Has she been eating properly, maintaining personal hygiene? The second investigator asked. It's hard to say, Vivian replied. She's become very secretive and defensive. She locks herself in her suite most of the time and won't let anyone help her with daily activities. When we suggested she might be more comfortable in an assisted living environment, she became almost violent in her reaction. I was listening to a masterpiece of manipulation. Every reasonable response I'd had to her pressure campaign was being reframed as evidence of mental decline or instability. My consultation with an attorney became paranoid thoughts. My refusal to be railroaded into assisted living became violent reaction. We'd like to speak with her directly, the first investigator said. Is she home now? She should be, though I should warn you she can be quite hostile when she feels threatened. She may not be cooperative. I realized I had seconds to decide how to handle this. I could retreat to my suite and refuse to speak with them, but that would only reinforce Vivian's claims about my being secretive and defensive. Or I could confront the situation head-on and demonstrate that I was perfectly competent and articulate. I chose the direct approach. "Excuse me," I called out, walking toward the group with my most professional demeanor. I couldn't help but overhear, "Are you here to see me?" The transformation in the investigator's demeanor was immediate. Instead of the confused, potentially unstable elderly woman they had been expecting, they were faced with a well-dressed, clearly articulate woman who seemed perfectly in command of her faculties. "Mrs. Fairmont?" the first investigator asked, consulting his notes with visible confusion. "Yes, I'm Catherine Fairmont," I replied crisply. "And you are?" They introduced themselves and explained that they were following up on a report of concern for my welfare. "I see," I said thoughtfully. "And what specifically was reported?" They glanced at Vivian, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable, before listing the concerns that had been raised: confusion, self-neglect, paranoid thoughts, and resistance to appropriate care. "How interesting," I said calmly. "Would you mind if I asked who filed this report?" "The calls are anonymous," the second investigator replied, "but they came from a family member." "Anonymous," I repeated, looking directly at Vivian. "How convenient. Well, gentlemen, I'm happy to address any concerns you might have. Would you like to see my living space? I think you'll find it quite well maintained." I led them to my suite, acutely aware that Vivian was following behind us with an expression of growing panic. My living space was immaculate, organized, and clearly the residence of someone in full command of their mental faculties. My medications were properly stored and clearly labeled. My financial documents were neatly filed. My law books and professional certificates were prominently displayed. "This is quite nice," the first investigator said, looking around with obvious approval. "Very well organized." "Thank you," I replied. "I've always believed that one's environment reflects one's state of mind." I spent the next 20 minutes answering their questions with the kind of detailed, rational responses that made it impossible to claim I was suffering from any form of cognitive decline. I discussed current events, demonstrated my knowledge of my own finances, and explained my recent decision to consult with an attorney about property rights related to my substantial financial contribution to the home's renovation. By the time they were ready to leave, it was clear that they found no evidence whatsoever to support the anonymous allegations against me. "Mrs. Fairmont, you seem to be managing very well," the first investigator told me. "Your living situation appears stable and you're clearly competent to make your own decisions about your care." "I appreciate you saying so," I replied, "though I am curious about the allegations that were made. Is it common for people to file false reports with your agency?" The investigator's expression hardened slightly. "Filing false reports with Adult Protective Services is actually a serious offense. It wastes valuable resources and can constitute harassment of elderly individuals." "I see," I said thoughtfully, glancing at Vivian. "Well, I certainly hope that whoever filed this report was acting out of genuine concern rather than ulterior motives." After the investigators left, Vivian stood in my doorway with her face flushed red with humiliation and anger. "That was quite a performance, Catherine," she said through gritted teeth. "Performance?" I replied innocently. "I simply answered their questions honestly, though I have to say I'm quite curious about these anonymous allegations. Someone seems to have given them a very inaccurate picture of my mental state." "Maybe you should consider why people are concerned about you," Vivian shot back. "Oh, I have considered it," I said pleasantly, "and I've come to some very interesting conclusions. For instance, I've realized that filing false reports with government agencies can actually be a criminal offense. Elder abuse, harassment, that sort of thing." Vivian's face went even redder. "Are you threatening me?" "Threatening you?" I looked genuinely surprised. "Not at all. I'm simply sharing some legal information I came across during my research. Did you know that financial exploitation of elderly individuals is a felony in this state? As is attempting to have someone declared incompetent through fraudulent means." I could see the wheels turning in her head as she processed the implications of what I was saying. "You're being paranoid again, Catherine," she said weakly. "Perhaps," I agreed. "But my attorney will be able to advise me about whether my paranoia has any basis in reality. Speaking of which, I should probably mention that he's recommended I start recording our conversations. Apparently, it's important to document any attempts at coercion or manipulation." Vivian's eyes widened. "You can't record private conversations without consent." "Actually, I can," I said cheerfully. "This is a one-party consent state. I'm allowed to record any conversation I'm a participant in. Quite useful for protecting oneself against false allegations." The color drained from Vivian's face as she realized that everything she had said to me could potentially be used as evidence against her. "You're insane," she whispered. "Am I?" I asked pleasantly. "Well, I suppose that's for qualified professionals to determine. Speaking of which, those investigators seemed quite convinced of my mental competency. One might even say they were suspicious about the motivations behind the anonymous report." Vivian turned and stalked away without another word, but I could see from her posture that the dynamic between us had fundamentally shifted. She was no longer dealing with a confused elderly woman who could be easily manipulated. She was dealing with someone who understood exactly what she was trying to do and had the knowledge and resources to fight back. That evening, I heard raised voices from the main house. Vivian and Patricia in what sounded like a heated argument about how to handle the Catherine situation. Through my window, I could see them gesturing animatedly in the kitchen, clearly frustrated that their carefully laid plans were not proceeding as smoothly as they had anticipated. Around 8 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Jonathan. "Mom, I need to talk to you," he said, and his voice sounded strained. "There seems to be some confusion about what's happening at the house. Can I come back?" "Of course," I said. "I'll put on some coffee." As I prepared for what I knew would be a crucial conversation, I felt a grim satisfaction. Vivian's escalation had backfired spectacularly. Instead of making me appear unstable, her tactics had exposed her own manipulative behavior to outside scrutiny. The Adult Protective Service's investigators had not only cleared me of any competency concerns, but had also documented that false allegations had been made. Most importantly, Vivian's attempts to keep Jonathan in the dark were starting to crumble. The arrival of his mother-in-law with a moving truck's worth of belongings, the mysterious utility inspectors, and the visit from APS had all occurred while he was at work. But news travels fast in neighborhoods like Elmhurst Gardens, and I was willing to bet that concerned neighbors had started asking questions. As I waited for Jonathan to arrive, I realized that we were approaching the point of no return. Vivian's campaign of escalating humiliation had pushed the situation beyond the realm of family disagreement into something that could only be resolved through direct confrontation. The question was whether Jonathan would have the courage to face the truth about what his wife was really doing, or whether he would choose to believe her lies rather than confront the uncomfortable reality of his marriage. Either way, I was ready for whatever came next. Jonathan arrived 20 minutes later, And the moment I saw his face, I knew that Patricia and Vivian had gotten to him first. His usual warm brown eyes were cold, and his jaw was set in a way that reminded me painfully of his father during their worst arguments. "Jonathan, we need to talk," he said without his usual greeting, stepping into my sitting room with the stiff posture of someone who had rehearsed this conversation. "Of course, sweetheart," I said gently, gesturing towards the chair where he usually sat for our evening visits. "Coffee?" "No, this isn't a social call," he replied, remaining standing. "I need to understand what's going on here. Vivian tells me you've been acting erratically, and now there are government investigators showing up at our house?" I felt my heart sink. They had worked on him all evening, feeding their version of events before I could explain what had really happened. "Jonathan, I think there may be some misunderstandings," I began.
"Are there?" he interrupted, his voice sharp with frustration. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're creating problems for my family. Adult Protective Services, Mom? Really? Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was for Vivian?" "Embarrassing for Vivian?" I repeated carefully. "Jonathan, I didn't call Adult Protective Services. Someone made an anonymous report about me, claiming I was suffering from mental decline and self-neglect. And maybe they had good reason to be concerned," he said coldly. "You've been obsessing over property rights that don't exist, threatening to sue family members, recording private conversations. Does that sound like rational behavior to you?" Each word hit me like a physical blow. This was my son, the child I had raised and sacrificed everything for, and he was parroting Vivian's lies back to me without even asking for my side of the story. "Jonathan, please sit down and let me explain what's actually been happening," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable. "What's been happening is that you can't accept that I have my own family now," he said harshly. "You moved in here expecting to control everything, how we celebrate holidays, how we raise our daughter, how we live our lives. And when we set reasonable boundaries, you've responded by threatening legal action and creating drama." "That's not what happened," I said firmly. "Your wife told me I needed to move to assisted living within a week. She's been systematically trying to push me out of this family. And when I sought legal advice to protect my rights, she escalated to filing false reports with government agencies." "False reports?" Jonathan's laugh was bitter. "Mom, you threatened to record private conversations and started ranting about felonies and criminal charges. If that's not concerning behavior, I don't know what is." I stared at my son, seeing him clearly for the first time in months. The stress lines around his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the way he was repeating Vivian's exact phrases. This wasn't Jonathan speaking. This was a man who had been systematically manipulated and isolated until he couldn't tell the difference between his own thoughts and his wife's propaganda. "Jonathan," I said quietly, "do you remember when you were 12 and broke your arm falling out of that tree in our backyard?" He looked puzzled by the sudden change of topic. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Do you remember what you told me in the emergency room? You said, 'Mom, you know you'll always tell me the truth, even when it hurts. I'm telling you the truth now, even though it hurts. Your wife is lying to you.'" His face flushed red with anger. "Don't you dare attack my wife. Vivian has been nothing but patient and kind to you, even when you've made her life miserable." Patient and kind. I couldn't keep the incredulity out of my voice. "Jonathan, she told me I was toxic and destructive. She tried to have me committed to memory care. She filed false reports claiming I was mentally incompetent." "You're being dramatic," he said dismissively. "Vivian was trying to help you find appropriate care for your changing needs. There's nothing wrong with assisted living." "There's nothing wrong with it if it's voluntary," I replied. "But being threatened with institutionalization because you won't be pushed around is something entirely different." Jonathan ran his hands through his hair,
a gesture I recognized from his childhood when he was frustrated beyond his ability to cope. "Mom, I can't do this anymore," he said finally. "The constant conflict, the drama, the way you're making Vivian feel unwelcome in her own home. Something has to change." "You're right," I said quietly. "Something does have to change. But it's not what you think." Before he could respond, we heard the sound of the French doors opening behind us. I turned to see Vivian entering my suite without invitation, her face flushed with anger, and her eyes bright with what looked like triumph. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I could hear raised voices, and I was concerned." "We're fine, Vivian," Jonathan said quickly. "Jonathan and I are just working through some issues." "Are you?" Vivian asked, her gaze fixed on me with unmistakable malice. Because it sounded like Catherine was making more accusations and threats. "I was trying to explain to my son that I won't be bullied into assisted living," I said evenly. "Bullied?" Vivian laughed harshly. "Catherine, no one is bullying you. We're trying to help you accept reality." "What reality is that?" "The reality that you're no longer wanted here," she said, dropping all pretense of politeness. "The reality that you're a burden on this family and a disruption to our lives. The reality that it's time for you to go." The cruelty of her words, spoken in front of Jonathan, was breathtaking. I looked at my son, waiting for him to defend me, or at least object to his wife's viciousness. Instead, he stood there in silence, his face a mask of conflicted emotions.
"I'm glad you're being reasonable about this," Vivian said finally. "Oh, I'm being very reasonable," I replied, setting the kettle on the stove. "I'm just trying to understand the logistics. When exactly am I supposed to report to Sunset Manor tomorrow?" "The appointment is at 10 o'clock, Vivian said with evident relief. "I'll drive you there myself." "How thoughtful," I murmured, reaching into the cabinet for my favorite mug. "And how long is this visit supposed to last?" "That depends on your adjustment period," Vivian replied carefully. "Some people adapt to institutional living quite quickly." "Institutional living," I repeated thoughtfully. What an interesting way to phrase it. I opened the drawer next to the stove to get a teaspoon, and that's when I saw it. The cast iron skillet that I had brought from my old kitchen, a piece that had belonged to my grandmother and had been seasoned by 3 generations of Fairmont women. Something in my expression must have changed because Vivian took a step back. "Catherine," she said uncertainly, "what are you doing?" "I'm making tea," I replied pleasantly, though my hand had moved from the teaspoon to the handle of the skillet. "Though I have to say, I'm fascinated by your approach to this whole situation." "What do you mean?" Vivian asked, her voice tight with sudden nervousness. "I mean the way you've systematically isolated my son from his family, manipulated him into believing lies about his own mother, and now think you can have me committed to steal my assets," I said conversationally, lifting the heavy skillet from the drawer. "Catherine, put that down," Jonathan said sharply, finally showing some awareness of the dangerous turn the conversation was taking. "Put what down?" I asked innocently, though I now holding the skillet in both hands. "This? It's just a family heirloom. My grandmother used to make the most wonderful cornbread in this pan." "Catherine, you're scaring us," Vivian said, backing toward the door. "Am I?" I asked with genuine surprise. "How interesting. Because you know what scared me? Being told I was toxic and destructive, being threatened with forced institutionalization, having my own son turned against me by a manipulative woman who sees her family as obstacles to her control." I took a step toward them, and Vivian's composure finally cracked completely. "She's having a psychotic break!" she screamed at Jonathan. "She's going to attack us! This is exactly what I was talking about!" "No,"
I said calmly. "This is exactly what you've been trying to create. Evidence of erratic behavior that you can use to justify having me committed." And then I did something that surprised all of us, including myself. I swung the skillet. Not at them. I'm not a violent person despite everything they had put me through. I swung it at the French doors leading to my patio, shattering the glass in an explosion of crystalline fragments that sparkled in the afternoon light. The sound was tremendous, like a gunshot followed by the musical crash of breaking glass. Vivian screamed and threw herself behind Jonathan, who stood frozen in shock. "There," I said pleasantly, setting the skillet down on the counter. "Now you have your evidence of erratic behavior. Though I should mention that destroying my own property in my own home is actually not illegal." But Vivian wasn't thinking about legalities. She was thinking about opportunities. "You attacked us," she shrieked, pointing dramatically at the shattered door. "She tried to hit me with that pan. Jonathan, you saw it." "I saw you break a door. You didn't actually." "She swung that thing right at my head," Vivian insisted, and I realized she was creating her own version of events as they happened. "She barely dodged it. She could have killed me." I looked at my son, waiting to see if he would support his wife's obvious lie or acknowledge what actually happened. His silence told me everything I needed to know. "Well," I said finally, "I suppose this gives you exactly what you needed, doesn't it? Evidence that I'm dangerous and unstable." "You are dangerous and unstable. You just proved it." "Did I? Or did I just prove that I'm tired of being manipulated and lied to?" I walked to my purse and pulled out my phone, calmly dialing 911. "What are you doing?" Vivian demanded. "Calling the police," I replied. "If I'm as dangerous as you claim, then certainly we need law enforcement involved." "Catherine, hang up the phone," Jonathan said urgently. "Why?" I asked innocently. "If your wife is telling the truth about me attacking her, then she'll want to file charges, won't she? And if she's lying, well, false police reports are also crimes." The 911 operator answered, and I spoke clearly and calmly. "Hello, I need to report a domestic disturbance at my address. There's been an altercation, and I think we need police intervention to sort things out." Vivian's face went white as she realized that her attempt to frame me had backfired spectacularly. The police would see the broken door, hear both sides of the story, and quickly determine that I had only damaged my own property. Meanwhile, her false claims about being attacked would be exposed as lies. "You're insane," she whispered. "Perhaps," I agreed pleasantly, "but I'm about to be proven sane by professional law enforcement officers. Can you say the same about your credibility?"
As we waited for the police to arrive, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. The war was finally out in the open, with no more pretense or manipulation. Vivian had overplayed her hand, and Jonathan had revealed exactly where his loyalties lay. Whatever happened next, at least I would be fighting this battle on honest terms. The police arrived within 10 minutes, and what followed was exactly what I had expected. 2 professional officers interviewed all parties separately, examined the evidence, and quickly determined that no assault had occurred. The broken door was clearly the result of my own actions on my own property. And Vivian's claims about being attacked were contradicted by the physical evidence and Jonathan's reluctant admission that I hadn't actually swung the pan at anyone. More importantly, when the officers spoke with me privately, they found a calm, articulate woman who was clearly in full command of her mental faculties. When they spoke with Vivian, they found someone making wild, contradictory claims that couldn't be supported by evidence. "Ma'am," the senior officer told me as they prepared to leave, "we're not seeing any grounds for criminal charges here. It appears you broke your own door during a family argument. That's not illegal, though we'd recommend family counseling to resolve these disputes more constructively." "Of course," I replied, "though
I should mention that there have been some concerning attempts to have me declared mentally incompetent and institutionalized against my will. I'm planning to consult with my attorney about potential elder abuse issues." The officer's expression hardened. "Elder abuse is something we take very seriously. If you believe you're being financially or emotionally abused, you should definitely speak with an attorney." As the police left, I looked at Jonathan and Vivian one last time. "Well," I said pleasantly, "this has been illuminating. Vivian, you now have a police report documenting your false accusations. Jonathan, you now have clear evidence of your wife's willingness to lie to law enforcement, and I now have official documentation that I was deemed mentally competent by investigating officers." "This isn't over," Vivian said through gritted teeth. "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "It's not over. In fact, it's just beginning." I reached for my phone and dialed Harold Buchanan's number. "Harold? It's Catherine." "Yes, it's time. I need you to file every lawsuit we discussed, and I need you to file them tomorrow. Financial abuse, elder abuse, defamation, harassment, attempted fraud, everything." As I spoke, I watched Vivian's face cycle through anger, fear, and finally the dawning realization of what she had unleashed. "Oh, and Harold, you were right about the frying pan. It did come in handy, after all."